Good afternoon. I think it's time to start. We are a bit behind. So welcome back for the second part of the conference. I'm very pleased to introduce Andrea Bassanini from the OECD. He will present the study Labor Market Concentration, Wages and Job Security in Europe. It's a joint effort by a lot of co-authors. Many of them are here. I think it's best if you stay there so that you can see the screen, and then you come back for the questions at the end of the session. So you have about 50 minutes. Then we will have time for a discussion and for questions. I also remind the online participants that they can ask questions using the chat that you may find that you can find on our conference webpage, and we will try to address your questions at the end of the session. So Andrea, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you so much. So the study I'm presenting here, it's as you see, it's joint work with a number of people. So 6 of them will be joining us for the discussion are here, and Eve, Paolo, Florentino, Michael, and Martin couldn't make that, and so unfortunately they're not here. It's on labor market concentration and particular its effect on wages and job security. In the discussion we can also discuss somewhat about labor market concentration. I don't think we have much to say about measures of concentration. It's more on the effects of concentration. It will be kind of difficult to maintain the same standards of the presentation of this morning, which are actually super excellent, but at least I can say I have an advantage that with respect to a usual presentation that we can do in different settings, I don't have to convince you that labor market monopsony is a hot topic which is of interest now for policymakers and for academics a lot. One natural, let's say, proximate cause of monopsony, as we discussed this morning, is concentration, in the sense that if there are few employers out there, then it's the number of possible outside options for workers remain limited. Of course, there are other reasons we could have monopsony without concentration, but if the market is concentrated, probably there is limited amount of outside option. And these considerations have pushed in the last, let's say, 10 years, or actually less than that, perhaps 7, a burgeoning literature in estimating the relationship between concentration and wages. We have tons of papers in the United States. A few of them are listed in the slide, but there are also a number of studies for European countries, for a number of different European countries. The problem is that we have plenty of single country studies, but these studies, they have all different methodologies, they have different data, and so we cannot really compare the point estimates that we find. And I think the US literature really testifies this, because we have plenty of different estimates for the same country, and this is due to the different methodologies. So the other issue is that, except 2 papers, the literature do not explore the non-wage dimension of job quality. Now, we know that jobs have also non-wage attributes, and that workers value these non-wage attributes in the sense that they're ready to trade off higher wages, or to trade off wages for these attributes that they value. Now, if these attributes are costly to offer by employers, we can expect that under monopsony, the monopsony will offer fewer of these attributes. The only papers that we are aware of that have explored this type of dimension are 2 US papers, one by Aaron Sojourner and UQ and another by epidemiologists, that have looked at the provision of employer-provided health insurance. And they all find a negative relationship between concentration and coverage by health insurance, but that's the only dimension which is very much specific for the US, and it's the only dimension that have been explored so far. So as you have probably understood, I mean, the objective of our paper is to essentially cover these two limitations, let's say, of the literature. And so the first thing that we do is that we provide comparable estimates for multiple countries, and as far as we know, we are the first paper doing so. These are obtained using exactly the same definition of local labor market, exactly the same concentration measure, the same dependent variables, and very much the same control. Of course, being so demanding means that we have relatively few countries that we can compare. And as far as we know, and that's the second point, we are the first analysis that tries to link labor market concentration to job security. And job security in this paper is proxied by two variables which are related to the distinction between temporary and permanent contract. So it's very much European-centric in a sense as a definition. And the proxies that we use as the probability of being hired on a permanent contract and the probability of being converted into a permanent contract if hired on a temporary one. Now, why these are good proxies of job security is because the expected, as we know from the data, the expected probability of job loss, involuntary job loss, if you are on a temporary contract is higher than if you are on a permanent contract. And even if you compound this with the fact that it's easier to find a same level type of job if you previously had a temporary contract, so the overall expected cost of job loss, you need to take into account the time you take to find another job, but if you combine the two things, the risk of job loss in all the statistics remain higher when you are on a temporary contract than when you are on a permanent contract, at least in the countries that we study. Finally, perhaps on the side, on one technical point, we would say rigorously control for productivity and for product market concentration at the highest possible level, so essentially by controlling systematically for plant by time fixed effect. And this is, in our view, very important because these are two obvious co-determinants, both of wages and of concentration. And so when the policies are clearly not the same, as we discussed somewhat this morning, is the problem arise from issues of product market competition, it's really a problem of concentration, or anyway, of monopsony in the labor market, controlling for competition in the product market. So to give you a rapid overview of the empirical results, essentially we have two key results. First, despite the fact that the 4 European countries for which we can compare data are very different, they range from Denmark, a market of flexicurity, so what would be considered in continental Europe as one of the most flexible labor market, and we range from that to Portugal, and although Portugal have improved a lot, in the past was called the most dysfunctional European labor market. So essentially, despite having very different labor markets, we find very, very similar elasticities of wages to concentration. We will discuss the point estimate later, so given that I understand that we need to run against time, I will try to go fast. The second result is that essentially everywhere, although there is much more heterogeneity in the point estimate, we always find some effect of concentration on job security, either on the probability of being hired on a permanent contract, or at least on the probability of being converted from temporary to permanent contract. And we think this is important because if we don't look at this additional dimension of performance from an individual point of view, then we underestimate what is the real cost for workers of finding themselves in an monopsonistic labor market. So this is essentially the outline of the remainder of my presentation. Unfortunately, I need to warn you that I will have to spend a little bit of time on data because essentially one of the value add of this paper is really to try to make things comparable. So I need to kind of tell you a little bit the way we have constructed the data. Then the rest will be kind of trivial, so specification, results, and I hope to spend a little bit of time on policies and to conclude. So on the data. Now, to construct a meaningful measure of concentration, the first thing that you need is essentially to have the universe of both workers and firms, or a near universe. And the reason is that if you have a sample, even a representative sample, well, this sample you will not have enough. And given the type of measure of concentration, we'll tend to overestimate concentration, to get too concentrated labor market. So essentially, but of course, given that the competition is in the labor market, it's at the local level, you also need the geographical location at a very detailed level. And lastly, but you need a very refined dimension either on the occupation side or on the industry side. This is what is done in the literature. We are very strong in choosing the occupation as dimension, and the reason, if you want, come from one of the slides that Alan presented today. When you think about the litigation literature, like the slide that was presented today on the high-tech case in California, clearly you see there that there were no poaching agreements across firms that were competing in different industries, like Pixar and Apple. Clearly they have nothing to do one with the other, but for the same type of professionals. So it's clearly people look for jobs in different industries for their same occupation. Similarly, there is a recent ILO literature showing that in specific industries, people in very different occupations do not compete for the same jobs. So like in the healthcare sector, you don't have medical doctors, nurses, and administrators. They do not compete for the same jobs, so particularly administrative assistants. So we need to distinguish this. This limits a lot the number of countries we were able to study. So essentially, we proposed to actually many other teams, but at the end, we ended up with six countries because they are the only countries with suitable data in Europe. The data are indicated there. I won't go into that again for issues of brevity, but perhaps what you need to keep in mind that the data have a very different structure. In the sense, for France and Germany, we have in practice, standard annual social security records. So we have information on all job matches in the year, and we have information on the annual wage. For Denmark and Portugal, we have similar information, but this is really located on a specific reference month, although we can reconstruct some of the history of the job history for workers that are present in the firm that very same month. For Italy and Spain, because of the limitation that we want on the data, we only can mobilize this administrative communication that we have mentioned this morning that companies are obliged to do to the labor authority. So the data in that case do not refer to job matches, but to contract. Of course, they can be converted into job matches. The advantage is that we can also observe changes of contracts that we cannot really do with the other sources of data. The disadvantage is that in these two cases, we want to have data on wages. Now, one of the key concepts that we need to develop is what is a local labor market. The literature typically uses one dimension, which is, as we said, either occupation or industry, and one geographical area, typically a commuting zone. The idea is that's region in which people typically commute for their job. Now, for most of these countries, there exist official commuting zones in different countries, national commuting zones. The problem is that these concepts cannot be mobilized because they are very heterogeneous. In Italy, you have 600 official commuting zones. In Germany, for a country which is larger, you have at most 150. So clearly, you are not using the same concept. So if there exists, Eurostat produces homogeneous commuting zone for the whole Europe, together with the OECD, but only for urban areas, which is typically a city and its catchment area. And these are constructed exactly with the same algorithm, the same parameters, so they are really, really comparable. But of course, this covers only urban centers. And as we discussed this morning, monopsony is probably more of an issue in rural areas rather than in urban centers. Anyway, all our estimates, not necessarily what I present to you practically, but all our estimates have been done also and are in the study. They have been done also for functional urban areas. But we also look for other alternatives. One alternative could be, as we heard this morning, Andrea talking about that, to use NUTS-free regions. This has been used by a couple of comparative studies producing measures of concentration comparable for a number of countries. The disadvantage is that NUTS-free regions are administrative concepts, and typically, indeed, we see that this is a problem for urban areas. When we look at the functional urban areas, typically they often span across different NUTS-free regions without covering all of them. And the reason is that the administrative decoupling of a country, I mean, the partition of a country has nothing to do with the economics of the local movement of the population. So it's not, the great advantage is that this covers the whole country. So what we prefer, we also do estimate with NUTS-free regions. What we prefer is a kind of a compromise of the two. So let's say a set of regions which is covered by functional urban areas, by all NUTS-free regions that have no intersection with a functional urban area, and lastly, for the remaining NUTS-free regions, we take the part that without intersection for each of them, provided that it is sufficiently large to represent a viable local labor, a reliable proxy of a local labor market. In any case, what we do, all our results that we'll present today, they are re-estimated, all of them, for all the three concepts, and essentially the results are even at the level of point estimate, they are all consistent. Okay. Last concept that we need, methodological concept we need to develop is what is the measure of concentration. Here we do not invent the wheel, so we use the Erfindal-Hirschman index as everybody uses. This is nothing else than on a local labor market, the sum of the square of the shares of all the employers. But it's a bit more tricky than one could think about because we need to define what is an employer. Normally an employer is a firm, in the literature is a firm as a legal entity. The problem is that with the German data, we don't have firm identifier. What we have is that we have the same, a single identifier for all the establishments of the firm that are in the same municipality. So to be comparable, we use the firm by municipality identifier. So for us, an employer is a couple firm by municipality. Now, in order to be sure that we are not introducing a systematic error, we have for the other countries tried to see what was the correlation between the measure using the classical measure based on firm and the measure based on firm by municipality as a definition of employer. What it turns out is that the correlation coefficients are very close to 1, regressing one on the other. The regression coefficient is very close to 1, and in any case, as an healthy check, what we do is we repeat for all the 5 countries for which we have the 2, we repeat the same regression, and actually I can say that we find exactly the same results. So essentially using firm or firm municipality doesn't introduce any systematic error. If any, estimates are slightly more significant using a firm identifier, but this is essentially due probably to the fact that we introduce a little bit of error in the data. The second problem would be the size of the municipality, which is different. I won't go for lack of time into this detail, but essentially we do the same type of exercise by experimenting in the countries where we can with different size of administrative region in order to be sure that the size of the municipality, which is heterogeneous across Europe, doesn't matter in this definition. Lastly, we need to decide what kind of so shares of what? Shares of employers, but of what kind of measure? And we use hires, as part of the literature does, and not employment, as would be classical in a kind of old-style literature. The reason is that, given that what we want to mimic is the effect on outside options, if a firm is downsizing and doesn't hire, it could have a large employment share, but it won't provide any outside option in the market. And so, as, for example, Ioana Marinescu have suggested in a previous paper, new hires is probably a much better proxy. In fact, the literature is more or less divided among the two. Often papers present both. We, of course, given the data that we have for 2 of our countries, we would be unable to present the same concentration indicators in terms of hires, in terms of employment. Last thing, we need to define a period of time where we measure these new hires, and this will be at a yearly frequency. Again, this is totally motivated by the type of data that we have. In terms of the period that we cover, it's about the 2010s, with a slightly difference across the countries, and we apply a number of filters. Perhaps the most important is that we are obliged to exclude self-employed. And the reason is, first, there is a pragmatic reason. They are not available in all the countries, but also that in the case of the self-employed, what you would like to have are not so much indication of self-employed as an enterprise, but what you would like to have is information on their clients, particularly when they are dependent self-employed. So it would not be meaningful to use this in our concentration measures. And for the same reason, we are forced to eliminate household employees, because we would need to have information on the households employing them. And this is not possible with the data that we have. So let me go quickly on the empirical specification. There are 2 things to notice. For the wages, we do what most of the literature does. In fact, Ioana, our discussant, I think we connect from a distance, have shown in a recent paper that a log-log specification is what better fits the data available. I mean, we can discuss this and the reason why this is the case later in the discussion. Perhaps the only important things to notice that we are a series of controls, of course, but particularly a series of fixed effects. Of course, we have a local labor market fixed effect. Of course, in the case of the wage equation, we can introduce an individual fixed effects, but most important, as we said before, is this firm by municipality by time fixed effect. So if you want, in practice, plant by time fixed effect, which captures productivity and captures product market competition, both at the national and at the local level. In the case of the question on job security, these are naturally, given that we look at contracts, naturally estimated only on new hires. They do not make much sense to estimate them on the whole sample. For that reason, we take out the individual fixed effect, and what we try to control for the heterogeneity of work is using the usual variables on demographics, that is education, gender, and age. Now, last methodological thing, of course, the problem that we have at the rest of the literature is that concentration is endogenous. For example, just to fix the idea, you can think about a new school is founded and start inserting in the labor market new graduates a certain year in a specific occupation. This clearly is a labor supply shock. We will tend to reduce the wage. But also with this, in particular, even more for the reduction in the wage, will create new opportunities for new firms, for new activities to enter the market. So naturally, this probably would lead to an increase in the number of firms, and so this would tend to reduce concentration. So at the end of the day, we will have a positive relationship in this case between concentration and wages, which in fact would be due just to reverse causality because of the local labor market shocks. So the ideal instrument that we could have is to find an exogenous variation at the national level that could control for the local shock, but should be due to something exogenous. So typically, where in cases, national studies, in a few national studies where they have the data, they use mergers and divestitures to at the national level, to instrument for this. Now, we don't have that in the data, and so as the literature does, we use a quasi-leave one out instrument, which the idea is that should capture the effect of these mergers and divestiture on national trends in concentration. So essentially, we use as an instrument the average of the logarithm of the inverse of the number of firms in all other labor markets within the same occupation. Why not using the average simply of all other concentration indexes? Because concentration is very much exposed to other types of shocks. For example, productivity shocks that are idiosyncratic on a firm, if the market is competitive, would tend to increase concentration, even in fact, there is no change in competition. But this wouldn't change the number of firms. So if, given that the mechanism that we have in mind is something which is related to mergers and divestitures, this has very much to do to the number of firms that are present in the market. Now, this is not without problem, and I prefer, if you allow me, to move the discussion of the problems later at the time where I present the results. Okay. Very quickly, some descriptives on concentration. I invite you not to look too much at the mean level of concentration, because the mean level of concentration is just the result of, for example, the fact that we use annual years. If you look at the paper of Azar, Marinesco, and Steinborn on the US, which use quarterly data, well, they have naturally a much higher concentration. We have just released an employment outlook where the OECD, where we compare concentration for 16 countries. We use quarterly data, and of course, concentration is higher. What matters, and this is something that you find in all the data sets where you can measure concentration, is that two things. One, which is homogeneous across data sets, is the fact that the distribution of concentration is very dispersed. The ratio of the standard deviation to the mean is always around 2. And this is something we find, again, for example, in the OECD data. The other thing to notice here is that across these 6 European countries, the level of concentration is very similar, with Portugal being perhaps the only exception. So, here are the main estimates. These main results are on daily wages. The reason is that for Germany, we don't have reliable data on hours for a sufficiently large number of years. And in order to have something which is meaningful and not to confuse us with the possible effect of monopsony on the choice of working time, so we look at full-timers in this table. For all the 3 countries for which we have data, we have done, and I don't think I have time to present, similar estimations for hourly wages. Now, as you see, the elasticity are very similar, as we said, across countries. They range between 0.02 to 0.03, meaning that an increase of 10% in concentration would reduce the daily wage between 0.2% and 0.3%, depending on the country, which may look very small, but in fact, you need to take into account the fact that the distribution is very dispersed. So if I move one standard deviation from the mean in any of these countries, I get an effect on the wage which is about 2 to 3%. Or to say it differently, if you move from the median to the highest decile, then the reduction, the penalty in the wage would be around 5% in all the countries. So it's not a huge effect, but it's not too small. Just very quickly, our elasticities compare very well to the existing elasticities in single studies in Europe. Of course, the comparison with the US is more difficult because, as we said, there are plenty of different estimates for the US, but they are in the ballpark of a few of them, and in particular, they are very similar to those found by Ben-Melek and co-authors, which is the only US study that simultaneously controls for productivity and product market competition. So in a sense, this suggests that these wage elasticities are extremely similar across countries. Now, one of the issues that we might have is that the instrument that we use might be endogenous. Why? Because we may worry that our instrument may capture national trends in supply and demand. So what do we do to try to do that? The first thing that we do is that we augment our baseline equation by including the share of, at the 4-digit level, of national occupations, the share in new hires for each national occupation. Now, the problem, of course, is that this variable is endogenous, so this is why we don't do it in our baseline regression. Including an endogenous variable in an instrumental variable regression is never a good thing to do. But our claim would be that if the violation of, let's say, if our instrument really pick up very much these trends in supply and demand, we would expect, without looking too much at the value, that our point estimate of our variable of interest would be affected significantly. If we don't see any variation, it's an indication of the fact that there is not so much pickup of these trends in supply and demand. Then what we, okay, let me show the results first. So on wages, what we find is that apart from Denmark, where the estimate is effectively reduced, for the 3 other countries, essentially, there is no change in the estimate. So this, to us, suggests that there is not much relationship between, if you want, much between the instrument and the residual of our baseline equation. Now, what we can try to do, and what we try to do, is also to try to ask ourselves how much violation of the exogeneity assumption we can tolerate to, if we correct it, to still have significant results in what we find. And so we use the so-called plausibly exogenous instrument regression method proposed by Conley, Jansen, and Rossi, which essentially is a very simple one. So the first equation that you see in the slides is nothing else than rewriting our baseline equation, but just including the endogeneity of the instrument. So when you see gamma z, gamma z is, we have rewritten the error term by including something dependent on the instrument and a standard error term. Now, if we knew the relationship between z and the error, or z and y, if you prefer, then we could see, if we knew the coefficient gamma, we could simply subtract from the left-hand side this gamma z, and then use z as a valid instrument for our endogenous variable, because in that case, that would be orthogonal to the error. Of course, we don't know it, but note that the problem exists only if gamma is negative, because if gamma is positive, given the positive relationship that I haven't shown you, but you will trust me, between Z and HHI, then if gamma were positive, we are simply underestimating with our instrumental variable the effect of concentration on our dependent variable. So essentially what we do is that we fix 0 as the upper bound of this gamma, and then we decrease it, imputing it each time, in order to find the point at which the value, the minimal value, so the maximum in an absolute term, the minimal value of gamma, that makes our estimate insignificant. Then to get a sense whether this is good or not, the question we ask, how much of the reduced form is really due to this direct effect of Z on the dependent variable, which doesn't pass through the concentration. So we estimate the reduced form, and then we take the ratio of the coefficient of the reduced form, the ratio of our minimum gamma to the coefficient of the reduced form. When we look at the result and look at the last line of this table, what comes out is that we can afford up to this direct effect to be as large as 57% of the overall effect of the reduced form to still get estimates of the concentration parameter significant, at least at the 10% level. And in the case of Denmark, that it was the most suspicious country, we can go up to 74%. So to some extent, this suggests that at least for France, Germany, and Portugal, our estimates are robust to very important violation of the exogeneity assumption, while the first test that we have shown suggests that rather the violation, if they are there, they should be minor. So overall, we believe that this suggests that our results stays there. And although I won't repeat this exercise for all the other countries, essentially for the other experiments, but essentially the results are the same for the other experiments. Now, I don't know how much time I have. Yeah, so I go fast. I skip a number of results because of lack of time. Let me go, to labor market concentration and job security, which probably is the most interesting result. So, as you see in this table, we find a heterogeneous effect, but significant effect on the probability of being hired on a temporary or on a permanent contract, which are significant in France, Germany, and Portugal. In Portugal, they are very, very large. So just to give an idea, in Portugal, these results that we estimate imply that increasing the concentration by 1 standard deviation from the mean would reduce the probability of being hired on a permanent contract by up to 24% in Portugal, while 5 or 6% in France and Germany. However, keep in mind that, as you see here, the estimates for Portugal are at the border of significance, and so they are very imprecisely estimated. The interesting thing is that there is no significant effect in Italy and Spain. Our conjecture, but there is nothing to prove it, is that this is due to the fact that in Italy and even more in Spain, most of the new hires are already on temporary contracts. And this is true also in markets that are low concentrated markets. So there is little scope to reduce this further again, so to increase the share, reduce the share of the hires in permanent contracts if there is a difference in the concentration. What is interesting is that for these two countries we can look at conversions, and the effect that we estimate on conversions are important. So conversion within 1 year, the next calendar year from hiring, we find that an increase of concentration by 1 standard deviation would reduce the probability of being converted by 28% in Italy and 8% in Spain. Now, in Italy, we have a little bit the same problem that we have for Denmark for wages. But there again, we have that the amount of violation that we can afford is about 66% of the reduced form. So, but if we include the share of national occupations, the estimates for Italy goes down more or less to the level of that of Spain, which is that doesn't change. So let me skip this, and let me go very quickly on a little bit of policies, although we had some discussion of policies this morning, so I will try to be brief and won't repeat things that we have, although they are prepared in the presentation we have already discussed this morning. I think what matters for policy of this result is that it's clear that monopsony and concentration has a significant impact on a number of dimensions that matters for workers. in a sense, there are two types of possible interventions for limiting the problem. We have discussed this morning a lot of interventions that reduce directly monopsony power. And these are much more in the realm of antitrust policy. But there are a number of other interventions that we have discussed a little bit, such as the minimum wage, that are more in the realm of labor policies. Although Alan have already discussed all of this, so it's perhaps not particularly interesting that I do that again. What I would like to discuss, if I'm allowed, a little bit more, is collective bargaining. I think from a European perspective, there is a lot to say, and probably this is one of the best instruments to countervail monopsony power. And the reason is that theoretically, we know that bilateral monopsony can, although they do not necessarily do, but can yield efficient bargaining results. But in the labor market, there is an old literature of the 1980s, looking particularly to the US in the 1970s, that tend to show that strong unions in very concentrated labor market leads to efficient bargaining. In particular, there is a paper by McCarthy and Pancavel on the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 1985, which is a very cute paper because it looks at the markets of newspapers in small local towns and the markets of typographers. Typographers, so typically there is one employer, one single newspaper, because the local labor market in that case is one newspaper, and the typographers were organized in the classical old-style US unions, so no newspaper could hire anybody that was not from the typographer unions. So 100% union rate. The estimates show that the typical result was the efficient results in terms of employment and wage. So that was a typical example of the fact that the bilateral monopolies in labor market can yield efficient results. And this is consistent with the recent work on concentration. I tend to show that where in markets that are more unionized, then the elasticity of wages to concentration is lower. And we have results for the US, UK, France, Norway. So, and Joanna has, by the way, participated to this issue. There is also some little mild evidence that the wage elasticity has probably increased over time, both in the US and Europe, while concentration has not. And one possible explanation of this is that collective bargaining has declined. So if we look at the evolution of collective bargaining, I'm smiling because Andrea is behind this chart, we have seen that collective bargaining in the OECD for employees has gone down from 46% in 1985 to merely 32% in 2019. So one important, I think in a Eurocentric view, important policy implication is that we need to revamp collective bargaining. And that, to me, implies two things that can be done at the level of policies. One is to reverse certain government policies that has been responsible in the 1990s and the 2000s of partially responsible for the decline of collective bargaining. There is, for example, I'm here speaking in my personal capacity of not of my co-authors. For example, the fact that an opt-in regime has been allowed in certain countries, I'm thinking about Germany, for example, rather than allowing opting out under certain regulated conditions from collective bargaining. Of course, this has led a number of firms to free ride if they were not signing this collective bargaining agreement. This has reduced enormously coverage of collective bargaining. But also the fact that it used to be a favorable tax treatment of union membership that all the countries have scaled back. If having workers that are unionized as a contribution, a collective contribution, but probably should be incentivized rather than not incentivized. And last thing, but this is very much in the radar of the activity for the European Union, is to try to allow workers that are in the gray area between employment and self-employment, to try to allow them to organize and collectively negotiate on wages and working conditions, which in certain cases could be dangerous in terms of possible infringement of antitrust law. I don't know if I still have time or not. 5 minutes, okay. If I have 5 minutes, I would like to just show you another exercise. This has nothing to do with our study in a sense, but it's more something that comes from a recently released employment outlook. One of the things that we have talked this morning, that one of the things is to increase outside options. And you see in newspapers sometimes that you see newspapers that say, yes, if now, with COVID, we have learned to do teleworking, if you allow people to do a lot of remote working, this would increase their outside options, and so this would allow them to compete more widely in a labor market which is not just local. So what we have done in this exercise at OECD is to look at occupations where teleworking is possible and to make a thought experiment to say, well, let's look if these occupations work became just remote work and not only, nobody more in the office. So you could, in that case, imagine that the labor market becomes the whole country. There is no local labor market anymore. And then we have looked at what is the effect on the average concentration. The effect is small. And as you see, the average effect on concentration is 22%, but keep in mind that this is an absurd thought experiment. And there are two reasons behind that. The fact that the big employers tend to be the same national companies everywhere. In fact, in the product market, we know the markets are becoming more and more concentrated. And so at the end, moving from local to national in certain occupation is not a big gain. The other thing is that those occupations that can be where teleworking is possible are already the occupations that are the least concentrated. So essentially, we are acting on one margin which is not the most interesting margin. So in a sense, remote work, well, could contribute, but we shouldn't think that this is a panacea. Okay, so just to conclude, well, the results, essentially, we have two results, or we have discussed them. So I think there is a lot of policy action that is still possible in this area. It's important to keep in mind that there are a lot of dimensions of job quality that can be affected. And so it would be very interesting to increase the amount of work that we do, not only in terms of concentration, but any types of study of monopsony, or the effect of monopsony on this dimension. As, by the way, Claudio was arguing this morning. And I'm done.
So thank you very much, Andrea. Also for summarizing your work even further for the sake of time. So now we have a discussion by Ioana Marinescu from University of Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, she's not here physically, but she will connect with us from the US. Can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
So welcome. I think you can start. You have about 15 minutes for your discussion. Thank you very much for being here.
Absolutely. I hope everybody can see my slides. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, great. So as Rodolfo said, I'm Ioana Marinescu. I'm actually right now on leave from the University of Pennsylvania. I'm the principal economist at the United States Department of Justice Antitrust Division. So I'll make some comments about that after I summarize the paper. So in the current context, we have indeed, as Andrea said, very large and developing literature on concentration, labor market concentration in particular, including my own work. And we see everywhere that labor market concentration is associated with lower wages, and there's also work in the US looking at mergers and showing that mergers that greatly increase labor market concentration reduce wages. And so importantly though, that's one angle, it is the wages, but monopsony power can be exercised through at least two channels, which is lowering wages, but also degrading working conditions. So the current paper's key contribution is to look across European countries in a unified way and comparable way, looking at the impact of labor market concentration, not only on wages, but also on job security. And so what they find, just to summarize again, they use linked employer-employee data with many controls, and they find that a 10% increase in labor market concentration reduces wages by about 0.2%, and which is consistent with some prior literature on European countries, including my own finding on France. And also, importantly, that's new here, reduces permanent contract hiring by 0.5% or more. So it looks like the effect on job security is even somewhat higher than the effect on wages. So again, this is an important channel to underscore here. So there's two main contributions of this paper. First is to solidify our finding that labor market concentration is associated with lower wages. Importantly here, using comparable data sets and also specifications econometrically across a number of European countries. And also to show, secondly, that labor market concentration affects non-wage job attributes, here focusing specifically on job security. So one technical slide to talk about identification here. So when reading the paper, I was a little bit unclear, and this is more an expositional issue, but they control for a lot of things, which is great as far as eliminating compounds, but it makes the results a little bit hard to follow. So basically my question is, what is the source of variation in labor market concentration that is still remaining given the many controls that they use? So importantly, they use individual fixed effects as well as firm by municipality, by time fixed effects, and also local labor market fixed effects. So, you know, it would be interesting to maybe show also some specifications with fewer controls and kind of build up the intuition of, you know, where the remaining identification is coming from, especially given that sometimes as an additional robustness test, which Andrea talked about, they also had the share of each 4-digit occupation in new hires at the national level to absorb, you know, trends over time at the level of the occupation. I do want to say that it seems to me that you know, the variation is a lot across occupations. That seems to be important, but I'd love the authors to comment around the remaining variation, again, given all their set of controls. And, you know, I also want to insist that it's really a plus here that they're able to control by firm municipality, by time fixed effects, because that's going to absorb time varying productivity shocks at the firm municipality level, which might potentially confound the results. And for example, because maybe an adverse shock in productivity might lower hires and increase concentration. All right, so now let me take you to policy implications, specifically with regard to competition policy. So we've seen that labor market concentration is associated with lower wages and lower job security in Europe. I mean, I think this is important to highlight here from a more OECD-wide perspective that, you know, relative to the US, European institutions are much more protective of workers. And yet we see that the lack of labor market competition still negatively affect workers in a similar way between the US and Europe. And so one policy lesson I think is that European competition authorities can consider beefing up labor antitrust enforcement, which is likely to yield some positive effects as far as both wages and working conditions based on the results in this paper and on the broader literature. In the US, as I was saying, right now I'm working at the Department of Justice in the Antitrust Division, and we're actually working on new merger guidelines in collaboration with the Federal Trade Commission. And, you know, we're saying that mergers between competing employers raise competition concerns. And we developed this idea on the specifics of what you should be looking at. And we emphasize in particular, you know, consistent with the findings of this paper that we've seen today, that both deteriorations in wages and in non-wage job attributes, such as safety on the job, for example, can be indicia of monopsony power. So that's a way that we can measure monopsony power, again, is both through wages that might be lower than the competitive level, as well as through adverse working conditions that would be worse than what would obtain under a competitive labor market. Now, that's competition policy, but there's another type of policy that we can use to address monopsony issues, and I call that raising the floor. So minimum job standards are going to limit the adverse effect of a lack of competition policy on workers, and this is particularly true for workers at the lower end of wages and education. And so I have a review of literature that recently came out with Jake Rosenthal in 2022 on worker power. And you know, some of the lessons we can take out of that, first is that one important instrument, of course, is the minimum wage. And my work has shown that you see more positive employment effects of the minimum wage in more concentrated labor markets. So in the most concentrated labor markets, not only the minimum wage can allow us to prevent wages from falling too low because of monopsony power, but it can even increase employment. And the reason why employment increases basically is because more workers are attracted to those jobs now that wages are higher. In Europe specifically, you know, I think it's important to think about better regulating the use of fixed-term contracts, right? The paper today was looking at hiring on permanent contracts. In many countries, there's a lot of hiring on fixed-term contracts. And I have a paper on Spain with co-authors showing the really adverse effect on employment over the long run of liberalizing the use of fixed-term contracts, so that young people who entered the labor market when these contracts were widespread had a worse career than people who entered right before. So this is something that, you know, deserves further consideration. And finally, of course, you know, stronger enforcement of regulations that are already on the book, including regulations around paying the minimum wage. And in the US, there's a number of firms that don't pay the minimum wage, and the Department of Labor is looking at, you know, basically fining these firms that don't respect the law, and also at worker safety. So all the safety regulations are also important, since again, this degrading of working conditions is one of the ways that firms can exercise monopsony power. So again, a fascinating paper today, and raises a lot of important policy issues, and I hope, you know, we can all make progress together on the policy front. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So now I ask you, the other co-authors, if they want to come here for the questions. Would you like to reply to the comments now, or we start with a question from the audience?
We could start with the questions, and probably it's easy.
I think I'm here.
Okay, there are two questions on the right.
So in the labor market, like the Danish labor market, where you have the flex security model, which you talked about, isn't that might have a different impact when you look at hirings compared to some of the other European countries? Because it might be that the initial wage you're going to have might be different, because then you might have a different kind of wage growth pattern in a country where you have a different level of hirings. When you have much more flexicurity, then you have a lot of hirings and separation compared to other countries, and it could have an impact on the wage level of the new hires relative to the wages in the general wages in the firms.
Mine is just a curiosity. I think you made a passing reference to trends over time. You haven't shown anything. Do you see in the 6 countries any trend upwards, downwards in concentration, or anything interesting, let's say, across countries on this?
Are there other questions?
Yes, my question is, I'm curious. Hello? Yeah, sorry. My question is, looking at the kind of linear correlations as you have, I'm wondering if there's any nonlinearities in this shape, if the results are driven by outliers, either on the low concentration or high concentration sides. It would be nice to see some sort of non-parametric analysis to look at that relationship.
There is another question in first row.
Thank you. Very, very interesting work. You stress a lot the fact that the elasticity of wages to concentration are the same across 4 or 5 countries. But I didn't understand why they should be the same, in the sense that does it strengthen your result or not? Because to me, it's suspicious that it's exactly almost the same. Is there any particular theoretical reason why they should be the same? Because the structure is so different.
So would you like to start with answer to this first round of questions? Who starts?
Okay, I try to go in order, and then my co-authors will, forgive me if I forget a few of the questions. Now, in terms of, thank you very much, Joanna, for your comments. As always, fantastic. If I'm not wrong, there was just one technical comment, which has to do with where the variation is coming from. So, a key identifying element is that we need to have multiple occupations for the same plant in a given moment of time. If there were just one occupation per plant, that would drop out. Provided that we have this, then we identify, at the very least, changes of different trends over time of the different occupations, but also changes of individuals over time in occupations, even within the same plant, or changes in the geography of the individual, and in that case, it would be changes also across plants because a plant is identified by a location. Now, this in the wage equation. It's even more in the case of the other equations, because in that case we don't have the individual fixed effect, and so it doesn't need to be, so it could be across individuals in that case. So that's for where the identification comes from. Then I think one point that you made that I find very interesting in the discussion, if I may, is on the discussion on the lot of action, particularly in the US, that there is, and it's actually very welcome, the action on antitrust. The only thing that I was trying to say before is that we shouldn't think that antitrust can do everything. So that I think it's really important, because think about the discussion about mergers. Mergers, when you examine mergers, you start now for new mergers, but a lot of concentration has already occurred in a sense. And so their merger review, unfortunately, there is little we can do. We're seeing the same type of problem in the product market. I don't think we are so bold, or in particular in the market, we have the instrument to go towards breaking up companies. Probably this is going too far. So that's why intervening on the effects becomes very important, why the minimum wage is very important, and this is why it's really important to also act on the collective bargaining side, and maybe this is not necessarily very pertinent in the case of the US, but it's certainly pertinent in Europe. And I'm not sure, and that connects with, I changed a little bit the order with what Antonio was saying, I'm not sure that better improving on all, let's say, the labor market institutions, including better regulating, for example, permanent employment contracts in Spain, it would really work to solve this type of problems. Also because I think that now that we have allowed a lot, particularly in the 1990s, a lot of, better regulating temporary contracts. And we have allowed a lot of temporary contracts. The firms have learned to use them. And so even if we make them much more difficult, now they have learned an instrument that it was not very well known at the beginning, and now they will continue to use it. For example, I mean, drawing on other papers that I have done, we see a lot of there are papers that show that an impact of social pressure against dismissals, and so firms tend to refrain to dismiss workers because of social pressure. What firms do in that case, they tend to do more temporary contracts because there is much less social pressure against terminating a temporary contract. Now, that means that we can even change employment protection, but they will still, now that they've learned to use the instrument, they have learned to use a way out, they still have incentive to do it. So I'm not sure this would solve all the problems. There was a question on new hires and incumbents. Now, I haven't shown you the slide, unfortunately, but essentially we get the same wage effects, or very similar, still significant effect on new hires and on incumbents. And I have another paper from France where we show that this is true even if you add, you still find an effect on incumbents even on when you add match-specific fixed effects. So essentially, it's not just at the margin that we see this effect. So it's a much more general type of effect. Trends over time, our trends, we haven't really studied much. I think in France are flat, in Italy are even decreasing in terms of trends of concentration. I don't remember exactly, perhaps our quota for the other countries. We believe that actually we had a too short period to study the trends, but there is, for example, another OECD study that came out last year that showing trends on 20 years, they were essentially constant on concentration, but showing that the average in Europe of wage elasticity computed in a different way, but it was kind of average for all the countries, and that was increasing over time. And the wage elasticity increase is also in the paper by Bemelek and others for the US. So this trend to increase concentration, we need to explain it, and I think the collective bargaining explanation seems to fit very well in the literature. On what is driving our results in terms of high or low concentration and so on, I think, we have started asking the question to ourselves when the paper was already written in a sense. We have done the test from France. On wages is if you split the sample into and just look at the bottom of the distribution, you get exactly the same effect that you obtain in the average. And my thought, which is surprising, we actually expected that this should be driven on from the top. I think the real reason, which is also the same reason why a log-log specification for wages works better. So anyway, to put the variable on HHI in log terms and not in absolute terms, is that we are not very good in measuring concentration for the top concentrated. If you think about if 1 year there is no firm hiring or no vacancies in that year, then that disappears. If there are two, you get a 0.25, hiring just one person, you get a 0.25 instead of 2,500 if you measure the US type in percentages. So relatively, it's still high, but it's much different from one. So you get a lot of variation for things that at the end are a very concentrated market period. So the fact that we are so bad, there is so much measurement error on the top that essentially we are driven by the bottom. And what the implication of being driven by the bottom is that we shouldn't just look at the most concentrated market. Like a lot of IO literature that tend to show that now that a merger, even changing a little bit concentration, in fact, could have devastating impacts on the product market. Well, I think the same issue is somewhat valid also in the labor market. So we shouldn't look just at above the threshold of concentration that are typically used by antitrust authorities. In a sense, these thresholds are too high, given the way we measure the. And that's it, I think, for me.
I wanted to make a quick comment. First of all, I'd say that I think the first ones who are surprised that the wage elasticities were the same across countries with such different labor market regulations for us. So it seems we're talking about level effects rather than elasticities. But in the case of, I'm working in Spain. In the case of job conditions, I think I am a little bit more positive than Andrea, that reforms might help. My feeling is, and the results of the paper show this in the case of Italy and Spain, that access to stable jobs is more of a problem when you are working in a concentrated area. And we see more things. We also see that in these dual labor markets, like the Italian and the Spanish one, the transfer of risks from the side of firms to workers is very intensive. Firms in the last decade in Spain, for instance, have been almost optimizing, if you say, the use of temporary contracts, slicing them up and restricting the length of those contracts strictly to the length of tasks. And we've seen this increasingly. Now, so we've passed the labor market reform in Spain in January that substantially reduces the scope for these kind of policies. And I think that better access to stable employment, since employers are forced to offer open-ended positions in many more instances, over the lifetime of workers will make a huge difference. So we're focusing now on wage elasticity, on new hires, but we have to think in dynamic trajectories as well. In concentrated areas, as a worker, you may be trapped in poor jobs for a very long time, and we haven't captured those results yet. And I hope the literature will move into this direction as well. We're focusing a lot on wages. We are one of the first ones, I think, to look at job quality, job stability, and I actually think that's an area of research that deserves a lot of attention, and I'd be very happy to see that the Spanish labor market reform, if it produces improvements in this direction. Thank you.
Just perhaps a couple of additional comments. Let me also thank Joanna for the great feedback. On the first point that was raised about whether to measure not only concentration but also the actual level of recruitment, if I understood correctly, I think this is an interesting idea. So perhaps there is some additional margin of potential impacts that has to do with the overall dynamic of the specific local labor market. Perhaps we already control for that through a number of variables that we had in our specification, but I think it's an interesting idea to see if there are some additional effects coming from these some proxies for the dynamism of each labor market. And then the second comment on the very last question regarding the fact that we find very similar results for labor markets that have very different labor market institutions. So I think we all agree that this is a surprising, at least to some extent, surprising result. It, of course, perhaps makes us think that we may need to invest in additional measures of the potential concentration of the labor market. We've seen earlier today that, of course, employers may collude, they may engage in a number of arrangements, non-compete clauses, no-poach agreements, and this, of course, can create some issues in the measurement of actual de facto concentration from the perspective of the outside options of employees. So you may have two local labor markets with the same number of employers, but actually in one case they are colluding, in the other they are not. This will introduce potentially some measurement error in our proxy for labor market effective concentration, which will then have or not an impact in terms of wages. The dimension which perhaps I find more striking concerns the considerable dispersion in the characteristics of collective bargaining across the 6 countries that we cover in this analysis. So some countries do mostly firm-level agreements, other countries have sectoral agreements, some countries extend these agreements widely, others do not. So potentially one could indeed anticipate some greater diversity in terms of the effects that we observe in the data. So this makes me think that indeed collective bargaining is a sort of a strange and largely unknown, unexplored animal in terms of its potential effects on labor markets. You could think of collective agreements as something that indeed would drive up wages, in particular for low-skilled occupations. At the same time, there may be a pro-concentration sort of dimension to collective bargaining in the sense that businesses and trade unions are establishing focal points for wages of particular occupations. So there is potentially an anti-competitive nature to this. And I wonder if these two effects sort of cancel out each other across these different countries, and this could be part of the explanation for our results.
Would you like to add something?
I just have two brief comments. On the trends of the market concentration, I can say that at least for the case of Spain, they have also been stable over time, at least for the time period on which we are analyzing the data. But we know that based on some previous research that this has to be taken very carefully, because we know that there is a difference between trends on local and national markets. We know that there's some research at the US, where we know that they have different trends over time, and even though we can say that overall, at least in some cases for this analysis, the trends are very stable, we also need to take them carefully. And about these similarities on the results across Europe, we also know that it's somehow hard to differentiate between the effects that might be behind it, because we know for sure that there are some countries where minimum wages may be biting or may have a bigger impact on how these elasticities change, and also this bargaining power and how the regulation is driving these results. So as we have said, this is something that needs more discussion and also further analysis, because I think it's also a very big contribution of our paper that is looking at this job stability dimension and these non-wage contributions.
Okay, thank you. We still have time for a few questions. If there are questions from the audience, or if Joanna Marinescu wants to add something to the discussion.
If I may, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just wanted to add on the issue of collusion. So, obviously higher labor market concentration could facilitate collusion. And it's true that, once the merger has happened, it can be difficult to undo it. But one thing that we can do, and we are doing at the US Department of Justice, is to look closely for collusion in labor markets over wages. And for example, you mentioned rural areas. So I just want to very briefly mention a case that we've had and where we're still working on. It's public information that the poultry processors, so these are plants, usually in rural area, that kill the chickens and slice them and then dice them. And so many of the big poultry processors, very concentrated industries, for 20 years have exchanged detailed wage information, often during secret meetings. And so right now we've filed a case against them, and there's a consent decree, essentially a settlement, where they promise, not to do it again. And there's an antitrust monitor that will be looking at going forward at them complying and not exchanging such competitively sensitive information that would allow them to, essentially collaborate on deciding how much each detailed category of employee in those plants will be paid.
Thank you.
Simply a clarification question and then a couple of considerations. The clarification question has to do with efficient bargaining, as you were talking about efficient bargaining. By efficient bargaining, we usually mean the fact that it is bargaining over both wages and employment. So I wonder whether this is what you had in mind, or you have a different way of thinking about efficient bargaining. Secondly, another way to read your evidence is the fact that in line with the new literature on monopsony, concentration by itself is not something that could be the source of monopsony power. So you can have monopsony power even in rather dispersed structure of employment and also of hiring. So in a way, also one way to read your evidence is that concentration doesn't matter that much in a way, and there are many other features that are relevant. So in that respect, what Antonio was asking before is in my view, important. So why should we have the same elasticity across countries? And finally, on collective bargaining, I share some of the skepticism that Pedro had on this one, for two reasons. First, because you are looking at local effects, and collective bargaining, the type of collective bargaining structure I think you were mentioning and measuring are centralized ones. So I wonder whether this is the appropriate level to deal with these issues and also this effect of concentration. And secondly, this type of collective bargaining structure may also give rise to collusive agreements across employers, and therefore you may get, where I would be sure and reassured that this is a recommendation, and actually this is something I'm going to ask to the leader of the major union, Italian union, in a few minutes, is that collective bargaining should do something about non-compete agreements. So it's the fact that they are completely silent, all the national agreements, that's a problem in my view. But I wonder whether we should really think that we should push in a direction of centralizing more bargaining to deal with monopsony. That I'm not so sure about. So
Hello, I bring one question that came out in the chat from Concho Artola. I wonder if you could elaborate on the consequences of approving the operations of platforms such as Uber in European countries in this setting, and in general, opening the door to platforms of this type.
There is a question in the middle.
Hi, do you hear me? Yeah? Thank you. Well, there are many reasons to believe that if firms can pay a wage below marginal productivity because of concentration or any source of market power, then women might be more affected by this because the markdowns that firms can take from marginal productivity might be larger for them. So I was wondering if you have anything on gender differences of these effects, and also if they vary across countries.
One last question. Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, there are no other questions, so I guess you can start to reply. Who's gonna go first? Andrea.
Regarding the last question, gender, we do an heterogeneity analysis, but the results are not completely consistent across countries. So we weren't able to draw a very definite argument regarding that, but we did look at it. Yeah.
But I think platform work is, and especially the regulation of that, is one of those instances where firms are trying to reduce workers' bargaining power, right? And so the mere classification of whether we should consider work in platforms as salaried work or as self-employment is crucial. The idea is that we may protect workers better if they become salaried workers. Very often it's a shady line. And so for me here, the interest really is in how to clarify the conditions under which we guarantee access to salaried work. And I think it's, well, Spain again has approved a law recently I think many European countries will follow, and I think it's going to be crucial for working conditions of workers. So I think we have to be ambitious to guarantee access to salaried work where it's reasonable to presume a working relationship. So I think that that should be the ruling principle. If there is the suspicion is or the presumption is it's a regular working relationship, and the employer would have to show or prove that it's not in order to avoid further degradation of working standards.
So perhaps just a comment on Tito's point regarding collective bargaining. And I think the question was whether centralization of collective bargaining may be a good thing in the present context, and given the new evidence in research regarding the amount of discretion that firms may indeed have in terms of setting pay. I think clearly the flow of the research and its potential policy impacts are in that direction. However, I would say that for instance, in the context of the European Union, we have very, very different levels in terms of the representativeness of the social partners that conduct the collective bargaining. So, and this both applies in the case of trade unions as in the case of employers and employers associations. And I suspect that this may be an important point in terms of shaping the policy agenda. If we are thinking about countries like France or Portugal or Spain with very low levels of trade union density, and potentially even worse outcomes in terms of their representativeness, in the sense that most of the members that are affiliated in these bodies have particular profiles, possibly older, more skilled, higher wages. This may potentially create important distortions in the context of collective bargaining and its centralization. On the other hand, of course, we know about the panorama in other countries in Northern Europe, where we have very high density levels and possibly very high representativeness levels in terms of a good match between the profiles of the individuals that conduct the bargaining and the individuals that are being represented in those negotiations. So I imagine this will be an important variable in terms of this policy discussion. However, I fear that in Europe, we still have little data regarding these variables. We are able to measure densities for employers and trade unions at the national level, but when it comes to sectoral bargaining, we may need to go beyond that and collect similar figures for each sector or each relevant sector. And this may require better data than the data that we have at the moment.
Let me go back just to make clear one point on at least the way I think this on collective bargaining. I was not meaning necessarily that the panacea is sector-level collective bargaining. What we need to leave, I think, the idea is that it's better without collective bargaining than with collective bargaining. So anything that allows firms to escape collective bargaining. So, for example, the point on the opt-in clauses in Germany that was making, I guess it's contentious, it's something that perhaps you were thinking about. Nothing against to say, if you have another collective bargaining at the firm level, you can avoid the conditions of the sector collective bargaining. But allowing firms to totally escape the sectoral level collective bargaining to do essentially in an asymmetry of power whatever they want, that requires a very high minimum wage to correct partially, but that's a partial correction because it is just at the bottom of the distribution. We know that there are spillovers, but it doesn't go everywhere. And also, it's a correction only on the wage. As we know that in principle, particularly at the firm level, there are a lot of, when there are negotiations also on working conditions. I mean, we were discussing workplace accidents. Otherwise, all these dimensions are totally left out. So that's the idea that was behind. I perfectly agree with you that the model that we use as economists as efficient bargaining is a model with wage and employment. But that's, in a sense, it's again, we don't have the model. I mean, in principle, because one thing is the model, one thing is the reality. The model tries to mimic a reality. We perfectly know that if you put two persons in front, they are able to bargain on three things rather than two. So this, in principle, I don't see any particular reason if we find efficient bargaining results in practice in the data on these two dimensions, I mean, I would be surprised that this doesn't come out also on other dimensions. But in a way, until we don't know, I mean, this type of evidence suggests us that probably it works. So the point is that when you do policy, you need to do it knowing the limit of the knowledge that you do. Of course, knowledge needs to go on, but you need also to do action. If you just wait and say, no, I want to stay with my old model, well, then it risks to make big errors, in a sense, and to continue to do errors.
Okay, I think we can conclude here. Thank you to you. One last question.
There's
no microphone.
You can,
It's coming. It's coming. In the first row.
I felt compelled to make a comment as a representative from the competition policy community and the competition enforcers regarding collective bargaining. Because collective bargaining, when you're speaking about solo self-employed are undertakings under the Competition Act. So there is a public consultation that was led by the European Commission regarding some guidelines for collective bargaining, which basically proposes an exception from Article 101 from the TFEU, which is the article regarding cartels that prohibits cartels, an exemption from the application of these articles to solo self-employed that are in a precarious situation. So here a note that, of course, this is a very important policy objective, in my view, to protect workers that are, or solo self-employed workers that are in a precarious situation. But it's very important not to overdo it and make sure that the criteria for application of this exemption is, in fact, solo self-employed that are in a precarious situations and that they have no bargaining power vis-a-vis their employers, but not more than that. Otherwise, there could be risk for competition. Thank you.
Would you like to react?
Can I use it? Just if I can respond on that. Now, that's, of course, it's where the antitrust approach, and I perfectly understand it, because you don't want to have typical cases, plumber dividing the markets, and so you don't want a blanket permission of. I wonder if the derogation is the best strategy. What you see other solutions, for example, which is used not for collective bargaining, but been used for other things in certain US states, in particular in California with AB5, is just to inverse the essentially the criteria that you use to identify whether somebody is a self-employed or an employee. Normally, typically, the default is that if you don't meet the condition, you are self-employed. And what has been done in AB5, not for collective bargaining, but for all the other dimensions of the employment contract, is that there is a list of 3 criteria, in fact, and it's enough not to meet one to be considered as a default an employee. I mean, if you have this, and this goes with collective bargaining, this would not jeopardize the TFU because, of course, you are not touching that. You are simply touching the way courts should work. So I don't know whether it's possible in any way. There is ways at the level of the European Union, because this is actually it's law enforcement, but this should be a kind of an alternative which is not risky in terms of antitrust, because totally protect what you really it's important for you.
Okay, thank you very much. We can conclude here. We are incredibly on time. It's the first time in 24 years, I think. So thank you to Ioana Marinescu, to the speakers, to the participants. Now we have a 25 minutes break, and a coffee will be served outside. It's very important, I know, at this point. We resume here at 4:25 sharp for the next last session of this conference.